Okay.
Okay. So shall we begin?
Yeah.
Okay. So good evening, everyone. And well, you'll see soon enough why I chose this film to discuss and how it kind of relates to my research at the moment. But this is the first feature film by this Greek director, Babis Makridis, and who had realized a short film before called Fakir. And after this film, L, in 2018, he made a film called Piti, Oikros in Greek. And then in 2020, a film called Birds or How to Become One. And this in particular is quite close to the kind of themes that you find in L. This idea of, as I want to address it, forms of life. You have, human life, but as it takes particularly rigid forms, right? Through the car, through the boat, through the motorbike in this particular film. And in this latest film, Birds, is literally people trying to escape all the limitations of human life by becoming birds, by trying to learn how to speak like birds, trying to even change their bodies in a sense. It is a metaphor, right? And a metamorphosis at the same time. So it is quite literary what you find in this film, which is also an adaptation of a famous play by Aristophanes, where the city of the birds is kind of a utopian city, dystopian to a certain extent. So themes are quite similar. Now, Makridis, together with Yorgos Lanthimos, who's the best known, Athina Rakel Tsangari, Hectoras Ligitsos, Alexandros Avranas, Economidis, Koutras, and a few others, are considered to be this Greek weird wave of filmmakers. And it is not really a school, right, or a movement of the kind of Dogma 95, for example, right? There is nothing really planned in what they're doing, even though in this particular case, Makridis has worked with the same screenwriter, as Lanthimos for actually many of his most famous films. So Eftimis Philippou is the screenwriter for this film, for L, but he's also the screenwriter for Dogtooth, for The Lobster, for Alps. And in fact, L is in between Alps and The Lobster. And in fact, if you know those films, it's quite easy to see a kind of progression in the themes of that Philippou was addressing. So in my analysis, I will talk about Philippou as one of the important authorial figures, let's say, one of the determinant of the themes and the ideas in the film. The label Greek Weird Wave was introduced by Steve Rose in 2011, a few years after Dogtooth, and has stuck, right? As we were saying with Aliber before, I think it still works as a description for this kind of cinema that originated in Greece and then through Lanthimos was kind of exported in the US, in the UK, and that has become kind of a recognizable style in global cinema, if you want. Usually in the few books and articles that have been dedicated to it so far, it is described as a cinema of crisis. Because, well, so it happened that the first film that was recognized to be weird in this sense in Greece also came out in the year of the Greek economic crisis, early 2009. And there are a few ways in which these films do talk about precarity or unemployment or various forms of discipline that we can relate to, neoliberal government in general, and that will be part of a reading of the film. But I've been looking at all these films from the Greek weird wave, and in fact, one of the first and main characteristics that they share is that they are in fact more specifically about patriarchy and sexist violence, which is arguably part of capitalist crisis. Silvia Federici made this argument, an American feminist scholar, that to all the moments of crisis in the history of capitalism corresponds an increase in the violence against women. She sees patriarchy, its restructuring, and sexism in general to be, one of the fundamental aspects of capitalist exploitation and government and rule. So that's clearly something that emerges in the films, because there's quite a lot of sexist violence there and patriarchal power as well. If you think about Dogtooth, if you've watched it, it's the story of a patriarch basically holding into his power, captive in his house, his children, his wife, and he's controlling every aspect of their lives. And it will come back as a reference during the analysis. Another aspect of it, which is quite evident, but has been kind of put in print recently by Dimitris Papanikolaou, a Greek film scholar. The other aspect of the Greek weird wave that kind of goes beyond the idea of crisis is that it is in fact a film about biopolitics. So a film about direct rule over life and discipline of the body. And this at many levels, the level of, the kind of power that the films describe, but also at the level of the style of acting, for example. And we'll talk about it later on. So for the analysis of this particular film of Elle by Makridis, I really want to focus on this idea of form of life, precisely as it combines, if you want, a question of precarity, of vulnerability of lives, these forms that the characters are trying to keep, these roles that they have to perform, seem to protect them from a kind of violence that they would be exposed to otherwise, from the environment, from certain people. And at the same time as this, contemporary neoliberal form of biopolitics, of discipline of the body, I think in general, you really see clearly in this kind of cinema how it is, conventional exchanges of gestures, conventional exchanges of words that submit people to certain powers. So it is really something quite close to what Judith Butler had in mind when she wrote about performative power, a power that invests lives and bodies as certain performances are repeated over and over, and people are habituated to them. And these performances become operative and powerful in defining what people are, to which categories they belong or not, whether they count as human or not. And this, I think, is made quite clear in the film from the very beginning. Yes, I guess that's it for an introduction, right? Then we can go over some of these issues and points of view, as we watch the film. So as we were saying with Aliber, I'll be talking over the film, so I'll be sharing my screen now with the film. I'll cut the sound so that we can talk over it. And I'll try to stop from time to time so that you can react, you can share your own impressions or ask questions, and we can try and have kind of a discussion over the film as it goes. So let's begin. And the first scene is already a rather dense one from my perspective, so I may have to stop the film very soon. Right? We have this weird song, and at the end of the film we will have another song, but this song is about falling out of the human form, actually, right? There is a metamorphosis into a bear. And from the very beginning, this question of the form that human lives may assume, which defines humanity in a certain way and disciplines it, is appearing, first of all, through this negative, in a sense, through a loss of humanity and transformation into a form that is not recognized to be human. And this is quite close, in fact, to a concept that is connected with the idea of form of life, which is that of bear life, which is, if you want, either a kind of formlessness produced by power, to put it simply, when it does not recognize a life to be human, or something that is, captured outside of form. There is, first of all, a requirement that people's lives respect, assume certain forms, and on the background of this, but as a production of power, as a product of power, there is the specter, if you want, of a life without a form, which is also a life that is exposed to unlimited violence, right? This bear will be hunted. In fact, he seems to be already dead in a certain sense, and there is an ambiguity to his status, whether he is alive or dead as a bear, that the film will play with, which is very coherent with the Agambenian idea of bear life. So a life that is captured under power to the point of being exposed to extreme violence. And already the title of the film, this L, which of course stands for the process of learning, the condition of still being in the process of learning how to drive, more specifically, seems immediately to be directed towards life as well, right? That this is that is pointing to the kind of work and the kind of requirements that people need in order to live their lives. And there is this strange combination from the very beginning of the film, or a kind of metaphor, if you want, between the life that the people, some of the characters, live, and the kind of vehicle that they drive. There is the driver, there are the riders who ride the motorbikes, there will be a skipper who pilots a boat, and in many ways we see this correspondence between a life and, well, in this case, a medium, a vehicle, an object that corresponds to its form. And indeed, here, the very idea of life is mediated literally through the car. The car becomes the container, the form that people's lives are forced into, to the point that we have this absurd situation in which people meet and talk to each other from their respective cars, right? So there's a sense that they're not fully communicating. There's a sense that they are kind of trapped within their respective vehicles. And in this sense, to me at least, the car also seems to be a metaphor for the body, a bit like in the classical theory of the subject, right? You have the wheel controlling the body as a kind of instrument that it has under its control. Well, here we have the driver driving the car as if the car was the body. And indeed, it has to respect alignment with other people. In a variety of scenes, we see the car being moved so that it corresponds exactly with the position in which the other characters are, as if it had to align with the direction of enunciation or something like that, as you would look somebody in the eye. And immediately after, right, in this scene, which is one of my favorites in the film, we see a characteristic of this formality of life. So this fact that lives are really captured into a form that is very rigid, that is separate from them, like the car is separate from the driver driving it. And we see the formality, I mean, because this scene is supposed to be about this father taking his children for a drive. And literally, that's what's happening. Only this is shown to be meaningless, you know, without proper direction. They're not going anywhere, right? The drive that they're having has nothing meaningful emotionally, right? It has nothing meaningful in the sense of going somewhere. It's just referring to itself, right? It is this roundabout, which, you know, technically performs what it claims to be doing, a drive somewhere, right? But erasing everything about it, apart from the what happens at the level of enunciation or the formal level, the symbolic level, if you want. And the circularity of this, the meaninglessness of this, resolves the pure formality of the lives that are involved here, the lives that we have here. So it's a purely conventional, purely ritual performance that we see. I think it's an important characteristic of all the performances, all the gestures that we find in the weird wave of the Greek cinema. And it's a very common characteristic in Lanthimos's films as well. And we see further on how his life and his job, his life as a man, if you want, and his job as the driver coincide, are difficult, almost impossible to set apart, so that when he will lose his job, his position, his role as a driver, he will also kind of literally lose his form of life, also at some point losing the car. He will lose the place where he sleeps, right? And here we see him, you know, in this intimacy with the car, right? Then we also see the shoes that will come back in connection with the other forms of life that we see in the film. And so, you know, he is the driver. There is no other name to the character in the film, which is also important. Naming is an important aspect of the film as well. He doesn't have a proper name. He is the driver. In this sense, again, what he does and who he is cannot be distinguished And this puts him in a particularly precarious position, right, soon enough in the film. So it's a way in which the film really shows how precarity is not simply an economic and social condition, right, that can be improved or may be distressful, but that immediately becomes a form of government, a form of domination, a kind of violence even. And indeed here, while he's going to work, right, fetching this best honey that he has to take to his boss, to his master, I'm tempted to say, he's whistling the song that we heard in the first scene. So the song about the bare life, if you want, being transformed into something else than a human. And the song that evokes this boundless violence to which we are subjected once we lose the prerogatives of the human, once we fail to perform in the ways that correspond to our form of life, or the kind of performances that we are required to perform. And here, right, we have this strange man who is his boss. And we see for the first time this ritual, right, that is part of his job, right? He's not just asked to fetch the honey, kind of transport a commodity, is not simply doing a delivery, but he has to deliver some lines like an actor, right? This will be clearer in a later scene when he will even rehearse some of the dialogue that he has to share with the man who's producing the honey, right? And that's another aspect of the film that we will address later on, right? This meta-cinematic aspect, in fact, in which the character's role is also very close, almost indistinguishable from the actor's role in the script of the film. So that, the form of life of the characters is also the role that the actors have in the script of the film that defines the characters, right? So we'll talk about that later on. Whenever we see this performative, theatrical, if you want, dimension in labor relations, I think we can say we're addressing something like gestural labor, something that is characteristic of the service sector in particular, right? So when you not only have to do a productive activity or serve a certain purpose, but you also have to style yourself in a certain way in order for your job, for your function to be carried out, like the smile of a waiter, or even more deeply into the history, in the genealogy of this kind of connection between labor and biopolitics, the smile of the domestic labor, of the housewife, even, right? Who has, in classic feminist theory, not simply to do the work in the house that is not even recognized as work or paid as work, but also has to perform with naturalness the expectations, right? The gendered expectations relating to and defining that job precisely as a form of life, the housewife, the labor of love. Federici talks about critically, right, starting from the 1970s. So you don't have just the buying and the delivery of a commodity in the case of the honey, but the delivery of a performance. And the whole imbalance in the situation conveys this sense of exploitation, right? He will lose his job very easily, right? The discipline relating to what he has to perform is very strict. But the film, in this sense, I think, shows labor relations also as a matter of domination, not just as a matter of exploitation or contract, but as a matter of a direct control of life, right? So that, again, when he will lose his job, or even when he is put under threat of losing it, he is immediately put into an existential threat. His life is put in danger very directly, not because he won't have enough money to pay the rent, but directly because it affects his very being, the very ritual exchanges of gestures and words by which he is recognized as human. Here we have the first meeting with the friend, right, which happens in the car. The second one will happen with the driver being on a motorbike. We see the alignment again, the house in the back kind of reinforces this geometric aspect of the scene. And the friend himself has his own form of life, his own style, which is, well, it is more of a desired form of life, because he still to buy the boat that he wants to style his life after, so to speak. And again, we have a vehicle, a container, an object, which also works as a symbol of a whole way of life. It decides a set of rituals, a set of possibilities, a set of possible actions and desires for the character. And in this sense, it constitutes like kind of the material object that signifies a form of life. The skipper, the one who drives or pilots the boat. If you want, this connects the whole question of formality and form of life, as I've been talking about it, to neoliberalism, right? This is, if you want, the petit bourgeois anxiety about lifestyle and commodities in relation to the meaningfulness of life, right? My life would be meaningful as it is styled in a certain way through the consumption of commodities. These vehicles, the car, the motorcycle, the boat, define these rituals, and you can kind of buy the form of life you want, shaping it with this kind of illusion that you are shaping it by your own accord, through your own will. Here we see, the learning in one of the possible senses, right? Here he is teaching, the driver is teaching his son to drive. And here in the whole film, really, the driving license, the learner's permit, and the process of learning how to drive, I think becomes a question of how to drive and rule one's life. We can kind of say it in English. L stands for learning, but also for life. Arguably, it also stands for language, as we will see later on. And it is L in the Roman alphabet, even in the original Greek film. It is not lambda, but L. On the one hand, this stresses the gap between life and form. This form of life is not, whatever people do. And no life for Agamben is allowed under government and power to be its own form. There's always a form that is separate from it, like a category. A good example here, I think, to clarify things is gender. Right? Gender is a form, social, complex, but that is substantially separate from every single life that is said to embody it or said to perform it in a certain way. It is decided largely outside of the scope of action of the people who are recognized to be this or this other gender, right? And there is a significant work that one must put up in order to correspond and be recognized to be one or the other gender or one form of life or another. And in the same way, there is a substantial violence that one is exposed to once you fail to correspond. So in this sense, the car works as this form of life, as a category that shapes, defines, and by that controls people's lives. Here we see how, you know, in a way the car metaphorizes the house, not just because they're living there, but I think because, you know, if you look at the film as a whole, it works like the house as this place of the family institution. If you think about Marcuse, authority and the family, or, you know, even the popularized idea of the family being the model of all social relations, right? Kind of the microcosm that then corresponds to larger social structures. Well, the car plays a similar role here. It also works as this place of confinement that we have seen already in the screenplays by Philippe Wu by now with Dogtooth, right? As I was telling you in the introduction, there is this household in which children are trapped and educated, actually trained into a form of life that is weird enough and far away from you know, spontaneity or even, you know, shared reality, that it is in fact treated as something else than human. The film is called Dogtooth because these children are being trained exactly as if they were dogs. In fact, to some extent, they are led to believe that they are dogs, and, you know, that there are cats outside that are kind of the dangerous others, dangerous foreigners that will put their life in danger. And here we have this confinement that I think signifies a similar intensity of power over the lives of these people. In this sense, it is a form that defines and controls life. And it is quite different from you know, other ways we have in cinema and literature in connection with neoliberalism of thinking the interface between the body and a car or a vehicle. You can think about Ballard's Atrocity Exhibition and Crash, Cronenberg's adaptation, Crash, and Ducournau, Titane, the recent film. They all kind of deal with something different, I think. In those cases, you have the vulnerability of the body, right? For Ballard, the whole point is the wound as this kind of new sexual organ opened on the body by the car crash. And these films, I think, so films like Elle, or as well, a film like Elle in particular, because it's the one that deals with vehicles, I think is more interested on a different kind of violence. It is still a violent relation that exists between the car and the body, but it is here at the level of form, I think. So it's closer to what you get in Ballard, for example, when you have this idea of being stuck in traffic for, you know, a long time. And there's a famous passage in which he talks about the whole energy of a generation being expended in a traffic jam, right? Everyone is blocked in a car, and they are revving the engines, right? And this becomes a representation of the wasted potential, wasted lives in neoliberal society. And it is closer. Yes, I can hear someone.
No, maybe someone has the microphone
okay
open.
okay. And I think here it's something closer to this, right? The violence that is done here, it's by limitation, by constraint. There are no visible wounds there. In this sense, the car works as a container, as a form. Now, here we have the accident, right? And this is the way in which we are introduced to the riders. So to a competing or antagonistic form of life, if you want. So we have, people in cars and riders, motorbike riders. And these, here we understand, I think, another aspect of form of life. It's not just, the lifestyle. It's not just a matter of fashion. It's not just a cliche or a category. But it's something that is also linked with violence, with power. So here we have the whole view of the world, which corresponds to the form of life of the drivers, in which, car drivers are those who kill. Violence of a structural kind, we could say, on the road is car violence. And this is explained in a very interesting way, right? We're seeing this here, right? Cars are at the same time those that, or car drivers, are those who kill, and the only options for being saved, I mean, being taken care of. There are no motorbike ambulances, and that's, a silly, if you want, kind of literal, but very effective way of talking about hegemony. Right? Car drivers are an hegemonic form of life in relation to the road, and indeed it is, through an antagonism to this that the form of life of the riders is established from their point of view, of course. But this introduces more clearly relations of power there, and hegemony, and also questions of life and death, right, which will become more and more clear in the film. Now here we see, for the second time, the boss, the master, and we begin to understand, because he's late for the second time, that his job and his form of life are in danger, right? That he's in danger of losing them. And, it will be developed in an interesting way later on with the figure of the new driver. Then we move back to the friends, right? And we are in the harbor, and they are naming the boat that he wants to buy. And naming is an important aspect of this logic of the form of life, right? Here it's a proper name, but naming in general, as Butler put it, the power of naming, the violence can be done with naming. Here we see, repetition and variation of these, rather stupid conventional names that is being offered. It is a very disciplined, very dull, very conformist set of names that we get. And there is no dialogue here. The friend is asking, what the other thinks, but as soon as the other gives, another variation that was not included in the original catalog, this is immediately refused, right? As if it was a matter of fact or a law of some kind. The variations are no variations at all, and the whole operation is incredibly formal and devoid of any true dialogue or communication. That's an aspect of what is going on in all these weird wave films, kind of incommunication, systematic inability to communicate, because people only relate to each other at the level of the most formal exchanges of words and gestures. They only say what you are supposed to say in a certain situation, but in a way that is so devoid of feeling and devoid of anything but the formula, that it seems to destroy or negate communication rather than establishing it. So this is a matter of how, the routines that dominate life also crash it in a way. The routines, the rituals that define lives also make them unlivable. Right? We often have the sense that it's not real characters that we see in these films, right? That these are just roles or actors playing a part and very badly, right? That's also common to Lanthimos's cinema, in which all the actors are asked to speak in this very flat tone, and most of the time they only say the most banal things imaginable in a way that, in fact, by communicating on this, purely instrumental level, does not really do anything at the level of communication. And here they're discussing the substitution. And that's another characteristic of life subjected to forms. Forms stay. That's another sense in which they are separate from lives, and different lives can take those forms as an actor, in fact, takes up a role. Right? And here we have this, the new driver as a role that apparently has been taken by three characters in the film. First by the man who turned into a bear, let's say, then by the driver, whom we see here, and then that will be taken by the new driver, right? But all these roles are the role of the new driver. So we see very clearly how the role stays the same, while the lives that are embodying it, that are dedicated to it, that they're taking it up, can be exchanged, right? And this is, very clearly connected with exploitation and precarity, the very fungibility, the fact that of the body, the fact that the body can be substituted in a certain place within a structure. It may be a symbolic one, like in the family of Alps, where you have, people taking the place of people who have died by repeating the gestures, the rituals, some stereotypical scenes that they performed when they were alive, and that's presented as a kind of substitution, as a form of surrogate. And it is the case in capitalism and labor relations, but also, formal positions of power. The kingship, the crown remains the same while kings change. The worker at the assembly line can be substituted very easily by another body, while the role and the whole process stay the same. This is uncannily shown in the film to have something in common with theater and cinema. Right? These are lives that are taking up these roles and being substituted in performing them. And at the same time, in this process of substitution, they are exposed to violence. Right? They lose themselves, and they put themselves at risk. And here we see how he is rehearsing the role. Right? He knows that he will have to defend, let's say, his job and his role as the driver, right? And he is repeating like an actor would, right? Very quickly, the lines he'll have to perform with the man who will give him the honey. And this is quite uncanny, as I was telling you before, because this is at the same time the character in the film rehearsing, and basically the actor in the film rehearsing the same role. And this is part of a series of ambiguities that we see precisely at this threshold between life and its form. One of the thresholds of the point of contact, of the boundaries between life and form, is indeed the one between the body and the roles, the kind of performances that it does. And here, this is kind of a job interview or a test on the job, which takes this at the same time very mechanical and somewhat theatrical dimension. This is very bad theater, to be sure, kind of an operative theater also, because the life of the people here are really at stake. They're not, just performing a role. But it's all very formal. It's all very removed from spontaneity, from the kind of spontaneity we want to associate with life. Indeed, these films arguably show the power that all these symbolic structures of signification and of power have over our lives. They show the mechanicity, the repetitiveness, the formality of human life that we may not want to look straight at. For one, because it really compromises our sense of agency. Here, everyone seems to be playing a role that they really do not control. And here we see he is screaming, right? But he is screaming in a very strange way. And this is a technique of a distanciation, if you want. It is a way of showing the detachment of the character, but also of showing, this gap that I was talking about between life and form. Again, he is driving around the roundabout and he's screaming in the same way, and he is expressing anger in the same way, formal way in which he is driving around the roundabout. Right? This is not really an expression of feeling, a naturalistic one that we would expect, by a character, but it's just, the signification of a scream. I don't know how to put it. Right? He is gesturing a scream, but not really screaming. And on top of this, he's doing it with, the kind of emotional detachment or insensitivity of somebody who could do something like that in front of his children, right? So there's all kinds of inability to communicate at stake here. Now, this is the scene with the new driver. And we see on the one hand the competition between them. We also have some clues about the status of the previous new driver, the friend. Again, everything takes place through cars. The car is still the medium here, but significantly the new driver enters in the car, which is something no other character really does apart from the friend. So it's different from the relation with the family there. And he takes the place possibly that was of the other driver, right, of the previous new driver. That we have this kind of performative requirements of the job, right? That it's not just a matter of bringing back the honey, but also of delivering a certain performance, really highlights how this is a kind of a character role and not just a job, right? The new driver as a job position implies a story. And the story that we're given, in fact, is a story about something like the state of nature or the state of exception. It is the story of the wolf and the ant, right? The wolf has killed another animal. What was that? A rabbit, and the ant wants to take revenge, right? So it takes a giraffe, a penguin, and a parrot, right, other animals, to band up against the stronger wolf, and the wolf kills them all. And the moral of the story is the most brutal affirmation of the power of power. In fact, power over over the law, even, right? There is no other right than the right of the strongest. And in this sense, the story can be taken to address a state of exception in which, you know, the very domain of the law, as we will see later, the very sphere of humanity is decided upon by force. This returns over and over in Filippo's screenplays. If you think about The Lobster, this is very clear, right? We have a power, a government, in fact, that decides on the exception to human life, right? I don't know if you've watched the film, but the idea there is that the government requires people to be in a couple, and as soon as you are single, you become single for whatever reason, you lose citizenship. So you lose the formal recognition of your belonging to society, to human society, to the community, to the city. And at the same time, in a sense, like we find here, immediately you lose the human form as well, right? So you are transformed through a mysterious operation into an animal. And, you know, this kind of decision over the form of life is characteristic of this conception of the state of exception, of basically the power of the state, in fact, to decide over the conditions of recognition, over the conditions of application of legality, over the very formation of society and the boundaries that define, the body as human together with its belonging to a certain community. This is also quite close to Sade, in fact, Marquis de Sade, but I don't think we have time to get into that. Here, third time to the house of the master, which resembles a little bit the one in Dogtooth, here with the barrier closed, the gate closed. And we have this scene in which, he has lost his job, he has lost his position as a driver, he's beginning to fall outside of his form of life, and he has no contact with the master anymore. Only the door to the house of the master is closed, only the voice of the master can be heard, right? So he talks to him over the how's it called, this device that we see here. I forgot the name in English. And this mediation of the voice, especially in the form of recording, is very prominent in Filippo's screenplays. Again, if you think about Dogtooth, that's the way in which language is taught to the children who are trapped in the house. They learn it from recorded tapes, and there is no face-to-face relation, if you want. So if it is arguably a way of presenting this formality and power connected to language and learning. The characters then speak in this kind of detached fashion, as I suggested before, as if they were speaking from a language book, as if they were, simply repeating the stereotypical scenes and vignettes from a language learning book, rather than actually living or saying something themselves. Right after, he is denied access, right after, he really understands he has lost his form of life, he kills a life. Here he is driving very fast, sees a dog, steers into it, possibly on purpose, right, and kills a dog. And this, can be part of this emotional detachment, this way of expressing rage, but I think there is something more here. We have a sense, perhaps, in which he is kind of diverting the violence that he has received onto another life that he can kill, right? There is a kind of hierarchy in the order of lives, right? As the master has a power over his form of life and then his life, he can kill an animal life because that's in his power, because that's a life that can be killed, a life it can be taken. So killing a dog instead of killing his boss, right? If you want, he's committing the kind of violence that he can get away with, because it does not fully count as violence in the same way as, the violence of the boss doesn't fully count as violence. He has just dismissed him, right? He has not killed him, even though in certain situations the two things may almost amount to the same. Quite clearly, in a film like this, the equivalence is very strong. And in the scene that immediately follows, like we're seeing here, he's rehearsing a scene of death, right? It's not immediately clear, perhaps, but he is switching place with the previous driver. And the scene conveys this sense, suggests, right, that he may be responsible for his death. Although it's not clear whether it is an actual death, because it seems that it is the man who has become a bear. And then also we will hear in a later scene that this man who has become a bear has been killed by hunters, but he's still there. And that's maybe a dream, maybe not. So there's quite a lot of ambiguity when it comes to the status of that particular life. Is it human or animal? Is it really alive or dead? And maybe what dies in these accidents, in these particular scenes between the driver and his friends, it's not so much the person, but the form, right? So there may be something of a rehearsal of his own death as well. I mean, his own loss of a form of life here. He goes back to this moment in which also he revealed himself to be not a very good driver. Right? He had pride in his ability as a driver, and from this scene, it seems like he did something wrong. Right? He did a mistake, which is something that will come back. Right? There's quite a lot of repetitions in this film. Will come back and happen to the Black Rider, so to the chief of the motorbike riders, right, who will commit a mistake, right? And indeed, all these forms of life are shown as very precarious. We have Meteor, the rider whose driving license is expiring, right, and who has to go through this kind of test to see whether he can still drive or not, and he will fail it, and this will immediately mean that he will die, right? So there's again this extreme precarity that lives are consigned to in their relation to their form as soon as they lose it. And from the death of the dog to the reenactment of the death of the friend, we get to the friend as animal. And we'll return to this road in the dark and to this walking on all fours in a couple more scenes in the film. And in this narrative of the bear and the hunters, I think we see how form of life is made to be necessary for the characters and for people under government and power. It is impossible for these characters to escape a certain form of life. There is a requirement that people must have a certain form of life, like in The Lobster, for example, like with the couple, or even still in The Lobster with the defining characteristic that everyone has to have. Because as soon as you do not have this, as soon as you do not correspond to a certain form, you're exposed to the boundless violence which corresponds to bare life. So in this sense, form of life is both the way in which power invests lives violently, in which it classifies and controls bodies, but also the way in which people are protecting themselves against this violence. And this is how it becomes disciplinary and pervasive. It is hegemonic in the same sense that the violence of the cars on the road is hegemonic. The only protection from it is the very road, very way in which this violence affects you. And it is a deadlock in many ways that is characteristic of the liberal state, if you want, of the state form in general. We have an interesting connection between the bear, so the particular animal that is chosen here as a figure of bare life, of this life exposed to the violence of power, and the boss, the master, because he's asking for honey. And that's a conventional kind of food for bears. In this, you could again find something coherent with this theory of bear life in Agamben. Right? For him, the figure of the outcast of the life captured outside of the human form and the life of the sovereign are similar, as he puts it, put in a zone of indistinction. So they are both a bear, but they are different in the way they bear violence. If you want to go on with the wordplay, their relation to violence is different. So there's a form of the bear man which corresponds to bear life and one which corresponds to sovereignty. Indeed, what comes next is well, it's here actually a little bit earlier, is a discussion of cannibalism. So a primal violence of human beings against human beings, but of human beings against human beings as animals, as wolves to each other, as in the tradition of political philosophy. And this may seem to be something like what Zizek calls pre-political violence, but in fact, this is the violence that establishes rule and order and that governments perpetrate. It's not something that comes before power and government, but something that is produced by them. That's an important thing to keep in mind when we talk about bear life. For a philosopher like Agamben, it is not, kind of natural, spontaneous, pre-political, savage animal life that is then invested by power and human society, etc., and rituals. It is the product of those rituals. It is the kind of shadow that power casts on subjectivity by making violence to them, by exposing them to violence. And here there's a very interesting scene, again, a very interesting idea to me. The friend here, the driver, he's talking about the revenge that he will bring upon the man who will kill his friend, right? And he says that this violence takes the form of a random word that is uttered right before dying, which is a very weird idea, right? And it's something that will return at the death of Meteor, this kind of execution that the riders will stage. And it's quite interesting to try and make sense of it. Why a random word? What could be the meaning of this meaningless word? What I came up with is that it works like a kind of insult. It breaks the kind of solidarity that human beings may be seen to have through language. To put it in Agambenese, in the language of Agamben, it would be the breaking of the oath of language. So if language is something that defines humanity and structures, makes possible a human society, a collectivity, dialogue, the random word, the meaningless word is the word that breaks this solidarity, this bond among human beings. And we do get something like this in Dogtooth, right, where the parents of these children that are to be trained like dogs are preparing tapes in which they give definitions of words that make no sense, that are wrong, that are misleading. So they are breaking through this breaking of the relationship between words and things that we could share with others. They are breaking the possibility of communication for their children. They are using language as an instrument of control, of domination. And, you know, we're not far from the classical example of 1984, right, with war being defined as peace and so on and so forth. But it is even more interesting here, I think. Then, well, the words he uses aren't really random, but the idea is still there. Here we see the shoes, right? And shoes are an important symbol in all of this, right? They will become central to the form of life of the skipper, right? Where the right shoes for the boat will become a matter of life and death. But here they are shown to be worn, to be used. So this, the shoes are this object that corresponds to a form of life, right? That kind of informs it, right? You need to have the right shoes in order to drive the vehicle properly, to lead the proper form of life. Without them, without the right prop, you cannot really have the right form of your life. But at the same time, they are an object that takes the form of the life, the feet, literally the body that is in them. So there is much more than in the case of the car, this connection with habit and use that we can talk about. If you want, right, you have this idea of the use of objects, both in the sense of the function that they perform, so they work like instruments, but also in the sense of use of habit, of something that you do usually. The etymology is there, and the connection is with habit and habitus, which is then a sociological category, right? Bourdieu. So a way, precisely a form of life that defines certain groups of people or certain social categories, right? Certain social forms and relations. And a film like this can be seen, can be used, if you want, to show the continuity between the level of performances, you know, the disciplines of the body in Foucault. So, you know, all these rituals that the characters perform around these objects or in them, etc. And the discourse of power that classifies lives in a certain way, that controls them through categories, and so on and so forth. So the car seems not to be affected by the presence of a life in it, right? You would say, compared to the shoes, the car isn't really modified by the life that drives it. But in fact, that's why we have, I think, the arbre magique, this perfume, this tree, because there's a constant reference to body odor in the car. And I think that's the reason why we have it, to show that, a bit like the shoes, there is this kind of reciprocity. But in the case of the car and in general, it seems that the relation of power is structurally unbalanced, right? That there is much more power that the forms have over the lives than what lives can have in defining those forms or changing them. Indeed, the only change that happens here in the film is either a change from one form of life to another or a loss of form, but there is no other logic. I think this will be the conclusion of the film and of the analysis, in a sense, at the end, right? That even as these forms are changed, the logic and the demand of power that lives have a form separate from them and to which they are consigned remains and is not really challenged. And here we have the whole ritual, the rite of passage from one form of life to another. When the when the driver becomes a rider, right, and has to abandon the car for a motorbike. And it's a long sequence, right, that follows, kind of outlines all the aspects of a ritual. The ceremony, right, the positions of the vehicles, all the different acts that have to be performed. The first step there is to crash the car, to destroy it. It is a kind of subjective destitution, if you want, right? He has to get rid of his previous form in order to assume another. But even this is done in just a formal way, I would say. Right? He's not really crashing the car. Right? Again, we are very far from Ballard and Cronenberg, where they were really crashing the cars. This is more like gesturing towards the crashing of a car, just showing the distraction, just complying with the requirement of damaging the car, but in a way that seems, kind of removed from its full expression. He's kind of expressing it as a concept. If you really want to focus on this idea of ritual, we have something like a ritual sacrifice here, right? Like if you think about the Christian tradition, right? The idea is to eat the flesh of Jesus or whatever, but you don't really eat it, right? You eat it in symbol. And here you destroy the car in symbol. Right? It is this kind of formality, in fact, that Agamben has in mind, that for him works as the model of performative power in modernity. There's quite a lot to say about that if you're interested. So here he shows himself naked, more or less, right? He's like a hermit crab changing his shell. And of course, the body has to be marked. There has to be a ceremony of pain here that brands the body into the new form. It cannot be just a matter of changing the vehicle. It cannot be just a matter of changing the shoes. There has to be violence. There has to be a branding of the body. And again, it stresses that the body is in relation with machines, with vehicles in particular, and there is no other way. And also it stresses how a body without a mark, a form, a name, a category, a ritual that stands for it in the face of power is a body that is unrecognized, unrecognizable, and thus killable. Right? So, he is, as I was suggesting before, hurting himself, but also in a sense protecting himself from even more violence. Or at the very least, you cannot easily distinguish the violence he's trying to protect himself from the violence that is part of this kind of symbolic protection. In a sense, this whole thing works according to a logic of the symptom, perhaps. Here we see how he has changed his shoes. So the whole ritual, right, is very close to this discipline of the body and the formality of institutions, the power of norms and normative performances. And then we are in epic. We have this chorus of the riders presented like a chorus from Greek tragedy, right? And there's a couple of moments in the film in which you have this epic dimension. You almost have the impression that you know, the riders and the drivers are like the two warring communities in the Trojan War or something like that, right? These opposed polities and cities. And then we have learning again, right? We are in the same space, more or less, in which the driver was teaching how to drive to his child, right? And here he is himself again, right? Marked by this L of learning, of the learning a form of life. And I think this quite clearly the film shows to be immediately a matter of life, right? So my example here, and I think we can return to it, is again that of a category that is immediately written on the body, like gender. Here, through these vehicles, you see this kind of weird metaphor for these forms of life that very intimately regulate our lives. So that, you know, the learning to drive is always the learning to live, but to live according to a certain form that has to receive formal recognition by external institutions and has to play out through these ritual, conventional exchanges of performances, of gestures, of words. This, to me, is the center of all these weird dialogues and weird gestures and performances that you have in the Greek weird wave. Then we have the new meeting with the friend. Again, the alignment between the body, the vehicle, and the addressee of communication is the same, right? But he's not recognized, right? And the driver, again, will not be recognized by his family. It's not just that the helmet covers his face and works as a mask in a way, but that he no longer has the same form of life. And immediately the concern of the friend is you know, one of comfort and life and death. Is it safe? I am uncomfortable with you in this new form of life. And it seems as if these external signs of life, the vehicle, the shoes, the garments, the habit, the habitus, matter more to the identity of the people there than the actual identity of the people, than, you know, whatever they share together. And that's quite clearly a spectacular logic. The ritual, the fetishistic detail, the garments matter more than anything else in defining what a person or who a person is. If you want an example from classical Hollywood cinema, this is the logic of Vertigo, right? Where Scotty, is in fact in love with an image more than with a woman, right? And he fashions her through all the details, the shoes, the color of the hair, the curl in the hair, right? That signify his relation to form more than anything else, right? Form more than substance. The body is exactly the same, but it does not, is not shaped in the right form. So that's, if you want, a matter of form of life too. And indeed, this aspect of these Greek weird wave films is also kind of inevitably metacinematic, because it deals with this formal dimension of people's lives, which is the closest to cinema in a way. And here we see, one such absurd performance, which is at the same time, fetishistic and immediately a matter of life and death, right? At first, we cannot understand. We just see this man doing something stupid, doing something, unreasonable, silly. And he will then explain, right, that he is basically testing his shoes and the grip that they have on the surface of the deck of the ship, because his father has died during a storm, because he didn't have the right shoes. We didn't have boat shoes, right? So again, failure to comply with the requirements of a certain form of life results in death. But this is also, if you want, the logic, the fetishistic logic of Scotty, right? You have to have the right shoes, which is also close to, capitalist fetishism, right? The idea that objects embody and give you a certain form of life, right? The Nike shoes, the shoes of victory, and the proper shoes for the capitalist environment, as the boat shoes are the proper shoes for the sea, and the boots are the proper boots for the motorbike, and so on and so forth. Which is again a matter of habitus, if you want. The friend goes back on the bus because he doesn't trust the driver anymore. And here again in this scene, the driver is not recognized. Here the choice of the form of life of the rider is presented as something immature, as if he had chosen, I don't know, to abandon his house and live on the road, something like that, so that he is rejected from his family. All these scenes in the car with the family make me think at the beginning of Hanneke's The Seventh Continent, right, where the family is in the car when it is being washed, and the kind of detachment in the dialogues and the gestures is quite similar. I think it is an aspect that the Greek weird wave has taken from the cinema of Haneke, especially from the Glaciation trilogy, right? This way of representing the fundamental incommunication that you have in neoliberal society, with people's lives being isolated, but also in a sense with each of our lives being, with ourselves being isolated from our own lives in a certain sense, precisely in the measure that we rather comply with roles and rituals that we have no power on, and that have quite a lot of power over us. So this power of formality, again, family rituals. And in order to justify his choice, right, he goes through this silly list of pros and cons, again, formulated as if in a language exercise more than anything else, right? That's kind of impoverished language, which corresponds to the impoverished life under neoliberalism, if you want. So it's precarity, but also a kind of expropriation from language, right? So that it no longer works as a matter of life, as the sharing of life, but only as this repetition of power and reproduction of its rituals. And here we see that he may not be entirely convinced by the form of life of the bike, of the motorbike, right? So he's asking the skipper about the form of life of the boat. And this is where we get the story of the father dying. And we always have this sense that we have an environment that is hostile, right? The sea, the road, the forest, the wild for the bear with the hunters, and that you kind of need a form of life with certain characteristics in order to protect yourself from and to navigate, let's say, the violent environment. That you need a whole technique of gestures and a whole set of instruments in order to survive, right? So here, another way of phrasing something that I've talked about before is that we are at this connection between Bourdieu's habitus, right, the sociological categories, the understanding of the various forms of lives in their social environment, and the Maussian techniques of the body, or the Foucauldian discipline of the body in a more critical sense. So that this habitus becomes immediately a matter of life and death, right? It's not just a matter of inequality, but it's a matter of domination directly, which I think is important to understand neoliberalism. Neoliberalism presents itself not as a system of government, but as an economic system. But what we see with precarity is precisely how it works as a system of government, as a system of domination. The shoes of the skipper, right, are this kind of commodity, but shown in their bare form, so to speak, without the fetishism, right? They're not like the Nike shoe, but they are, if you want, like the Nike shoes appear from an anti-capitalist sensibility. So not as this magical object, but as a purely conventional means of symbolic exchange within a structure of power. And the same goes for the performances of the characters, really. They are commodified in this sense. There are conventional exchanges of gestures and words, right, that the people, that define how people relate to each other. Now here we have a dream. And this is the scene I had in mind when I was telling you that to me there is a fundamental ambiguity in the status of the life of the bear man, right? He is the ex-new driver, he is the bear man, he's dead, but he's there, right? This is my best friend. He is a bear, but he thinks he is a bear, but he is a man. He was the best driver, but he has also died, right? So there is this whole confusion between animal and human life, life and death, which is very characteristic of this bear life that Agamben, as precisely as Agamben presents it. One may even wonder whether Filippo has read Agamben, because of how close and coherent many of the formulations are. The fact that this dream, because we know that it is a dream, because the characters, the driver is telling Black Rider in this scene, the fact that the dream is presented in film form also adds another ambiguity. We don't know whether we are, seeing a diegetic image of the characters, right? Something that is happening in the world of the film, or whether we see in the characters, the actors playing the characters in a sense, right? So there's an ambiguity as well that we've seen before in the rehearsal scene when the driver was, rehearsing a part. Is this part in the film, or is it the part he's playing in the film, in the sense, is the part the actor plays? And it cannot be decided, right? In fact, they coincide in that particular moment, which is a way to, I think, for Makridis and Filippo to kind of fold the film on itself in this meta-cinematic way, and to involve the spectacle, to involve film in this dimension of ritual exchanges, formal exchanges of gestures and images, right? There's quite a lot of repetitions, but the film as such, in a sense, its ontology, if you want, or its characteristic, is one of that is closely connected with repetition. There's quite a lot that is developed in this direction by Filippo in other films as well. We don't really have time to talk about it. Here we have a mythological moment, arguably. It's a very complex scene again. We have Black Rider telling the driver about an accident in which he lost a life that was dear to him. But it's not clear, again, if it is an animal life or a human life. We are told that this life, this person, if you want, was licking the asphalt because she liked, the gender is clear, but not the form of life in relation to humanity or animality. She liked to lick the asphalt close to the sea. And then we're told that she was disfigured, right? And she could no longer make a gesture with the hands, or a couple of gestures with the hands, that only a human hand can make. So the status of this life is undecidable. It is ambivalently zoe and bios, animal life and human life. And then we have this mythological logic that codes the whole story in this mark on the wall, which is supposed to be the stain of her blood on the stone, and that of course is just a rock formation, right? But what is staged here, I think, is mythology as a logic, as a way of making sense of the world. So again, we have, in a sense, a power of forms of storytelling in deciding over reality. Here we see how, from our perspective, it fails, right? It does not, but it's shown to define reality, at least for the Black Rider. There is this kind of mythological interpretation of this story. We're back then to the family meetings. He will be rejected again. He's trying to argue for himself through his skill as a driver, right? As a motorbike driver. So again, anything he can do, he must do through this particular form. And it's kind of hopeless and depressing to see, this kind of limitation. The spaces of the film are also deserted, right? It's a kind of neoliberal wasteland. Here, the road is a coastal road going to the south of Athens, if I'm not mistaken. And it is a kind of space that returns in many films written by Filippo. You have it also in Kineta. So it's possibly something that Lanthimos has introduced in the Greek weird wave. There's quite a lot of going back and forth there. Then Atina Rakel Zangari also used it, the coastal road. And then we have an accident, but of a different kind. Here, and I think it's necessary that we have a break in the coherency of this logic of form of life. We would expect the black rider to be hit by a car, right? That's how people get hurt on the road, according to the ideology, let's say, that corresponds to the form of life of the riders. And it is significant that the leader of the group of the riders is also the one who makes a mistake, right? It is his own fault. He fell on his own. And I think this is important because it denies the effectiveness and the coherency of the form of life there, so that we are asked not to believe completely in this logic. We are asked to see how it fails. And if you refer it to the one of the previous films written by Filippo, Dogtooth, again, you had this logic of antagonistic forms of life, the dogs and the cats. And in that film, it was quite clear that it was about the identitarian logic. It was the nation and the others. And of course, this is criticized, right? That's a kind of a fascist mentality that ties life to a form, to a nation, to an ethnicity in this unquestionable way. And here we see a fault in the logic. And this logic of the form of life offers no coherent explanation to life, in fact, but only offers power. So it is, I think, important that the film shows how these forms fail to claim life completely. Then we have this strange scene, right, which returns to cannibalism and kind of displays the omnivorousness of the bear, the fact that it is an omnivorous animal. And to me, I think it stresses the boundless violence that characterizes the position of the bear man, of this who is not a bear, but a man who has become a bear. So the eating of the flesh, of human flesh, cannibalism, and the exclusion from the human community are shown together. So this violence against men and this exclusion from the community that we have talked about in connection with the state of exception. And there is perhaps an invitation to join him, right, that we will see not really met by the end of the film. Here there's another scene with the riders, and aesthetically, this particular scene is quite similar to a film that was released in Greece the year before and was called Wasted Youth, That's the English international title, by Argyris Papadimitriopoulos. It was about, it had quite a lot of scenes like this, right, of young people from Athens going around on their scooters and talking at night with these lights facing the camera. And in part, that's a film about the killing of a 50-year-old student in the anarchist neighborhood of Athens, Exarchia, by two policemen, which started a wave of riots there. The film doesn't deal with that very nicely. I think it kind of depoliticizes it a bit. But perhaps I was thinking that this could be a relevant connection here, because this kind of boundless violence that lives are subjected to, at least in my perspective, it is the violence that lives are subjected to under the state, the kind of legal violence, so violence that can be done without punishment on people's lives. So, you know, just a connection. I'm not sure it's really in the film, but something that spoke to me at least. And what is at stake in this scene could be coherent, right? Because it is a matter of Meteor, one of the riders, having his driving license expiring. So we see this, you know, withdrawal of recognition from an institution, from the state, right? Also from the group of the riders. In fact, they take care of this kind of formal recognition. But, you know, as the life of the driver was put in jeopardy when he lost his job, well, here, when you lose your driving license, as we will see, well, that's a capital crime in a sense. And you are cast out of the community, but also you lose your life, right? Here we are quite close to what we will see with the lobster. Once you fail to meet the requirements, the formal requirements for citizenship, you lose your human form and you are transformed into an animal. Here, you will be killed, right? So they perform a test, which, you know, weird as it is a test about driving, but also about living, right? With the complicity of the camera in a certain sense. Meteor is asked to read, right? They have to test whether he is able to see well enough. I say with the complicity of the camera in the sense that we are put in his position, right? And we see everything blurred as he does. And, you know, there is this meaninglessness of language, right? He tries to decipher something, a writing that, well, to him cannot make sense, right? That he cannot, in fact, decipher. And he fails the test, right? So what follows is an execution. In fact, the test was a trial. And he is executed in a way that is perfectly and formally coherent with the form of life that he is, you know, trapped in or dedicated to, right? He is stuck, right, imprisoned even further within this form of life, right, is imprisoned in the helmet of the motorbike riders to the point of dying, right, to the point of lacking any kind of possibility for life, right? He will choke, he will be lacking air. Before he is executed, because this is an execution, right? That the driver, in a sense, officiates and testifies about, and that he is a testimony of. The Meteor says this absurd, this random word, monegasque, right? Which has no particular meaning. It is this kind of surreal breaking of the oath of language, again, which is his last word. And then, you know, he is completely consigned to the violence of the form of life until he dies. He has fallen out of the form of the rider, so he has fallen out of human life and life as such. And this last word, it's not clear whether it is uttered in defiance or in capitulation, in surrendering to the absurdity of language and of the rituals that command their lives, that control their lives. Now we're getting closer to the ending, right? There is a moment in which, and this is distinctive of the endings of Philippou's scripts. It is true in The Lobster, it is true in Dogtooth. We have seemingly an escape from violence, but quite clearly not an escape from the logic of this violence. So here we seem to think, right, that he has, chosen the bear, which is a form of life, but that is also this kind of animal form of life, right, beyond the human, that could be taken as something different than these other forms of life connected with a vehicle, right? Those could be the petit bourgeois ones, right? Those that are integrated in some ways in the system, and this would be a life of an outcast, right? Something that arguably could be also a position of resistance to the logic of form of life. It is characteristic of this logic to capture what is outside of it, inside of it, in the form of exclusion. So, the undocumented refugee is captured in the logic of citizenship in the form of exclusion. The single person is captured in the logic of the couple in The Lobster in the form of exclusion and is consigned to animal life. And here the bear would be this formless form of life because it is not human, something like that. And I think it's important that the scene is long. We have, again, the learning, right? He's learning how to walk like a bear. We knew from an earlier scene that it is difficult, that it is, heavy on the body. And there is also a sense that, they are kind of becoming the same. There is a mimesis between them that, it's echoing the fact that they were both drivers. In a sense, they may be the same person or they embody the same role. But then we have a twist, right? We could expect that to be the end of the film, but no. He has in fact taken the boat shoes, and then he delivers this ode to the sea, which is, again, this rather stupid, conventional, weird ritual that apparently he has to go through that defines, that expresses this other form of life. And there is this metamorphosis again implied, right, down to the body, down to the blood that becomes blue like the sea. And this kind of formal, rather insipid celebration of the qualities of the sea. There are lobsters in it. Without it, there would be no submarines. That's not really poetic or meaningful. So it is an ode that is performed just to perform it. There is no real communication or no real expressiveness being communicated here. The metamorphosis here, I think, anticipates the operation that we see in The Lobster, which is the next film that Philippou has written. which is directed by Lanthimos, but written by him still. And as I told you, I give quite a lot of prominence to the writing in this analysis. And the transformation in the lobster, and I think this film kind of makes it clear, is less to be understood as a mythical transformation, as a metamorphosis, like in the classical tradition, Ovid or ancient Greek epic, or a medical procedure as it is presented in the film, but directly as an operation of power, which is hidden, like all operations of power, behind the door, right? In the lobster, you have this door that you never see through, you never see the inside. It is closed to all those who are not either a victim of power or the performers of violence, those who victimize others. And again, there is this kind of distraction of communication in communication that is quite central there. And I think this scene kind of stresses it because it really doesn't tell us anything. And it is in this kind of death of meaningful communication that this formality and that power exerts itself through forms and rituals and regulated performances. And again, it has to be long and cheerless. And you know, you can hear the voice. It's off key. And that's something that had been kind of stressed throughout the film, because I don't know if you noticed, the soundtrack was a famous piece of classical music for piano, but played by somebody who's still learning how to play. So even that aspect of the film is coherent. It is, you know, as you see the lives of the people here, lives of people who are not very good at living, but they are not very good because they are under these rather extreme forces. They are constrained to an extreme degree and to extreme effects. So yes, I mean, that would be it for me. If you want, we can have a short discussion. You can tell me what you thought about the film, or if you have any comments about the analysis that I have proposed.
Okay, Carlo. Could I speak in Spanish for the people? And
sure.
Yeah. Okay. Bueno, justo parece que este ciclo, digamos, se cierra contigo este día. Tú eres el que realiza el último análisis y permites fácilmente reconocer cómo funciona una metodología de lectura a partir de un campo, ¿no? Campo de conocimientos, referencial, campo epistémico, a partir de un marco teórico, y cómo cambia una película de una perspectiva a otra, ¿no? Es decir, aquí no estamos haciendo un análisis comparativo, pero hemos visto a través de 6 sesiones cómo se aplican esquemas o perspectivas metodológicas diferentes a partir de autores y de saberes diferentes. Entonces, es interesante ver tu lectura y ver tus referentes y los autores que utilizas para darle sentido a la película, porque porque finalmente tanto la crítica como el análisis, ¿no? De film critics and film scholars, usualmente elaboran a partir de sus propios referentes con finalidades distintas, ¿no? Sus funciones son distintas, pero tienen una función en común que es esta, que es la de poder dar cuenta de los filmes, ¿no? Para los espectadores, porque un espectador promedio, digamos que ve la película y pues muchas cosas no las entiende y dice es una película rara, no me gustó o me gustó pero no la entendí, lo que sea. Y justo un investigador como tú, un teórico, le permite una puerta, ¿no? Le permite una forma, una vía, una salida a ese enigma que le presenta la película, que es uno entre miles que hay de propuestas, ¿no? Entonces, es interesante, insisto, para la gente que nos ve ahora y que ha seguido el ciclo y que sigue a Citacine y que va a ver este programa en el canal de YouTube, porque parece que si no lo tiraron en Facebook, no lo van a tirar en YouTube, es decir, que se va a quedar para la memoria. Me parece muy importante eso, que existan estas propuestas. Mira, en esta película, por ejemplo, eso que tú viste me parece interesante, aunque no fue la lectura que yo le di, ¿no? Porque a mí me sirvió más la película desde la perspectiva psicoanalítica, ¿sabes? Y desde la perspectiva de la masculinidad eh, y de efectivamente, cuando tú decías al principio que L es vida pero también es aprendizaje, ¿no? Justo yo la pensaba en esos términos de cómo llegar a ser o cómo aprender a ser eh, eso que al personaje parece dificultársele, que es ser un hombre, ¿no? Es decir, la leía desde esa perspectiva de cómo no podía, por ejemplo, con los hijos, luego no se encontraba en el oficio, luego no encontraba una identidad, ¿no? Es una película que me parece que aborda la identidad, insisto, desde la perspectiva que yo la leo. Aunque me parece muy interesante la perspectiva que tú das en este sentido neoliberal, crítico de la cultura, ¿no? Pero también me parece que se le puede hacer esa lectura del cómo la dificultad para aprender a ser hombre tiene que ver, bueno, con muchas cosas y que se nos presenta a todos los hombres hoy, ¿no? O sea, esta multiplicidad de identificaciones en las que intentamos caber, llenar, encontrarnos, y esta imposibilidad, ¿no? De ser un padre, de ser un trabajador, de ser un piloto, de pertenecer a un grupo, incluso en el asunto con el amigo, de ser un hombre y entonces preferir ser un animal. Es decir, me parece interesante. La película a mí me gusta mucho porque me gusta mucho esa estética crítica. A mí me parece que esa película tiene una estética crítica radical. Digo, es para mí muy, muy valiosa estéticamente hablando. Pero también pensando en el contenido, en el argumento y en las problematizaciones que nos puede plantear, me parece también que tiene mucho de dónde cortar o tiene mucho hacia dónde tejer para problematizarla, ¿no? Eso nada más.
Yes, and I agree. I mean, I think what you were talking about is a kind of part of what I was trying to say. I think to me, the discourse of the film is trying to get at something a little bit more radical. It's not just trying to be a man, trying to be the driver, trying to be the father, but in fact, the trials of being human, right? Trying to be human. In fact, people are, put under all these identities, right, that they seemingly can choose from. But what the film to me really is about is a lack of choice, really, and the kind of violence that subtends, that informs all these different identities. Right. That's why I think it opens with the bear, and it has this whole question of animal life there. Right. What happens when you fail? And fail in the eyes, not just of your family, of yourself, but in the eyes of power, really. And it's something that you find quite a lot in the Greek weird wave, right? The lobster is perhaps the clearest development of this idea, right? Which, the two things are connected, right? Once you are not able to be in a meaningful relationship in a couple, well, you lose citizenship. So the film is kind of putting together this question of personal identity with the question of political citizenship, right? And then people are killed or transformed into animals, or they are imprisoned as they try to find a partner, etc. So there's quite a lot of violence, I think, that is distinctive of these kind of films.
Sí, sí. ¿Alguien en la mesa quisiera hacer alguna pregunta? Rosa?
No, todo fine. Okay.
Okay.
Thanks. Gracias. Well, I hope the theoretical part was not too much of a distraction, right? I tried to keep it, as simple as I could. But yeah, to go back to your first point, Ali, but yes, I think what we have is possible uses of films. Right? It's not so much a matter of explaining what the film does, right? Because that's that's pointless, because it can do various things, right? But of using it in a certain way, and you can do it through theory. You can do it as people like Victor Bourguin argue, through your own life experience. Right? There's quite a lot of ways you can do it, in context with other people, right? During a screening or whatever. There are various ways to use films. And to me, this is an important aspect of their life, right, as films, right? Which makes them rich, right? Well, if you just analyze them with the idea that they mean something to begin with, that has to be uncovered and deciphered, etc., you are losing something of their potential, losing something of the experience, in my view, at least.
Yes, yes. Well, parece que no tenemos alguna otra pregunta. En este caso, pues te voy a agradecer la participación, Carlo, por haber preparado, por haber expuesto, por estar a esta hora levantado, que es muy tarde allá en París. En realidad es algo digno de reconocerse, de agradecerte, y de que sigas participando con el CITACINE como miembro activo. Pues vas a impartir clases en la próxima generación del diplomado. Entonces, pues seguiremos pendientes, seguiremos en contacto, seguiremos trabajando y colaborando juntos. Muchas gracias a todas por haber participado en esta sesión, Y les esperamos el jueves, que es el próximo cierre de seminario, nuestro seminario de investigación. Y el jueves 2 de junio, que es la última actividad ya de CITACINE, que es una charla que voy a tener con la crítica de cine Magali Olivera, que se llama Adiós a Hollywood, en busca de públicos alternativos al mainstream. Entonces, nos veremos pronto. Muchas gracias a todas por su participación.
Yes, thanks for the patience, everyone. Thanks, Alibert, for having me, and everyone for being here.
Descansa. Buenas noches.
Buenas noches. Thanks again.